Our story begins on Wednesday, the 28th of August 1833, when slavery was abolished everywhere, except in territories ruled by the East India Company. It was then that an Irish doctor, named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, decided that the world was porous and riddled with invisible arteries that only he could see. Even as slave owners were being paid compensation, as if freedom was an infringement that had to be reparated, William sat in a garret overlooking the Hooghly River and pondered the arterial conduits of trade and commerce that had washed him like an errant corpuscle upon the shores of this enslaved country. Yes, and propelled by such sanguine visions, he percolated into Hindustan, soaking through barriers of Bengal and Orissa as an assistant surgeon, seeping into Bihar as an opium merchant, diffusing across the Malwa landscape in search of ore for the mint, and permeating into history with his telegraph wires. From pharmacology to the galvanic cell, William used every science known to man to piece together a country that baffled him and threatened to close its paws against his probing investigations. Yes, I am getting to that. 10 years into this project, William O'Shaughnessy found himself in the desert of Toke, along with a grand caravan of miners and salt merchants, looking for veins of copper. No settlements punctuated this land except the strange scaffolds built by nomadic barbers who eked a miserable existence here. The desert, which began north of Mutsiapur, infringed into the territories of Sindh with an unnerving abandon. No delineations marked this border, and in a country that was slowly being distributed into small containers, this was indeed a strange place. But O'Shaughnessy, to whom the world was porous regardless of where he might be, could see naught but fissures and crevices in this land, holes in the earth that leaked its minerals like open wounds. And here, amidst meager deposits of salt and copper, he discovered a deep fissure full of bakelite. So verdant was the find, that within a few feet of digging into the crust, the small nodules of bakelite gave way to crystalline obelisks and protrusions of diodes and receivers. Within 20 feet, deposits of complete telephones started to emerge from the ground. Indeed, rich were the mines. But this verdant find was located in that part of Toke which was deep within the independent territory of Sindh. Though this might not have been evident to O'Shaughnessy at the time of discovery, it was certainly clear to the head assayer who had procured a remarkable map for this expedition. I cannot tell you what this realization led to, but suffice to say that the head assayer was a distant cousin of Charles Napier, who called his illegal annexation of Sindh that very year
a noble piece of rascality.
With possession of the mines now secure, William O'Shaughnessy embarked upon the greatest mining endeavor of 19th century India. Teams of workers were conscripted and local barbers coerced to dig the first exploratory shafts. Teakwood trunks from the vasta forests were dragged like a giant caterpillar, to be hewn into shacks and offices, and to shore the mud and rock of the tunnels being dug. Geologists, cavalrymen and medical practitioners, telegraph operators, wiremen, electricians, bankers, hostelers and camp cooks, entertainers and crooks, all descended upon the site as the first tunnels were inaugurated. Of what use are exact dates and years? Does it not suffice to say that the mines, which were as yet shallow, only about 30 feet deep, had already begun to yield great numbers of telephones, some small and delicate, and some as large as an elephant. Observation decks and elevator shafts were built. Great rotating wheels were erected to pump air into the mines. For one whole week, a train of camels unloaded brass lamps from the ore that were stored in a newly built warehouse. Clothing karkhanas were set up that worked tar soaked jute into hard shoes for the miners and made cotton scarves for the supervising Europeans. Elephants were shipped to the inhospitable desert at great cost to help pull and tug the telephones from their phonic bed. Yes, the people, the well mining crews from Srinagar and Burma, from Ceylon and Hampi and Kadirmuga, started to descend upon the settlement, and were readily hired. Abutting their mine shafts, there erupted countless hovels of worker colonies, or what were to be later called Khanparas, and a little removed from the mines, there arose larger buildings for quarters and offices, churches and workshops, each a thin-walled ramshackle structure that poked into the sky. Until from the nothingness of the desert, there emerged a misshapen town. William O'Shaughnessy, who was appointed Director General of Telegraphs for his discovery of the Bakelite pits, received a knighthood in 1866 for the telephone mines. And though he left the town a little after its founding, he gave a name to the settlement, calling it Telephone Nagar. And with newfound prosperity, there appeared like a tide of locusts hordes of officers and revenue clerks, managers and traders, accountants and munshi, members of that peculiar race who speak both Firangi and Hindustani. A race of administrative service officers, the lower magistrates and the adjunct collectors. Indians who had been trained abroad for just such tasks of collating the whims of change. This new and formless settlement attracted them, this absence of discrete boundaries. Where else could you live in such proximity to the British, the Dutch or the Americans who worked alongside them? Where else were you allowed to so clearly see what being an equal might be like? Not that they were equal. There were separate living quarters, of course, separate messes and places of worship and even separate streets. But to be so close to the foreigners was exhilarating. Perhaps they were foolish. But remark these men, for they are crucial to our tale. It was these men, these officers of the company, who on a borderless land, discovered a finite margin. For it was against the nebulous assault of sand and mud, and the uncertainties of the mining pits, that they could delineate their own form and purpose. Somehow the harsh land erased other loyalties and helped keep the delicate balance of their lives in careful accord with their rulers. To this strange milieu arrived Iqbal. Yes, Iqbal the barrister, Iqbal the revolutionary, Iqbal the unfortunate, or simply Iqbal. He came to this town riding a roving tide of humanity and attempting to efface the terrible years he had spent at Hertfordshire, before being appointed the administrator of the Ambrose Shaft, the deepest active mine at telephone nigger. Save for his morning rounds, Iqbal rarely went to the actual mine. The rest of the day he spent in the cavernous records hall, maintaining a careful roster for the teams under his charge. It is the same hall that you haunt today, turning such records as have survived into paper planes in your boredom. Perhaps it was the emptiness of this hall when the rest of the town was crowded. But something gave Iqbal room to ponder. Why was the telephone mined in only a single language, he wondered. Each telephone, once extracted, was refined and processed such that it would only allow English to be spoken through its receiver. No other language would transmit. And this bothered Iqbal, who knew, as we all do, that telephones in India have long predated the British Raj. Why even Tughlaq was known to have shifted to Daltarbad to avail the magnificent, naturally exposed telephone that sat like a boulder upon his palace grounds. Yes, they may have been forgotten. But Iqbal believed that some small change in the refinement or extraction process might be enough to yield a modern Bakelite telephone that could speak in many languages, perhaps even all of them. Such radical thoughts he kept to himself. And, when time permitted, he experimented, for his was the legacy of O'Shaughnessy. And he found it easy to bend wires and tubes to his will. And much as O'Shaughnessy had done, he too began to think of the world as a porous body waiting to be punctured by cables and pipes carrying blood and sound. Reticent though he was, word of Iqbal's experiments percolated through the town and roused a deep anxiety in his fellow officers. Those who had prided themselves on their certainties saw in Iqbal's endeavor a malevolent threat to their way of life. For their certainties were born of a particular kind of fear. The telephone was a sacred emblem of their station as the chosen ones. They feared its proliferation and they feared its authority. To so debase such an august instrument was tantamount to sacrilege, of this they were certain. Yes, it does. And at Telefonica, this violence erupted when Iqbal proclaimed that he had perfected the first Urdu telephone, and that he awaited a phone call to test its efficacy. It was this proclamation that killed Iqbal. They pushed him into a shaft that he supervised, and he fell 1,203 feet into a hole called Ambrose, until every bone was crushed like tinder, and his flesh so deeply lacerated that it left a streak of blood, marking the passage of his body down the shaft. The next day, with forced joviality, lest the horror of their crime be made apparent, the murderers and their masters filed into the records room with a new camaraderie. As they reached for their muster sheets, they were startled to discover Iqbal seated upon his usual dhurri, waiting beside his telephone. His face was still lacerated and his mien was the color of a white dhoti. His limbs contorted in odd shapes with bones protruding the flesh, and his teeth rattled as he spoke in garbled bursts. But there he was, Iqbal, or what was left of him. The sight of Iqbal animated the memory of his murder. The records room was boarded up, though no one remarked upon the folly of entombing a ghost. People were prosecuted. The mines were abandoned. The shafts destroyed in a riot. The city dwindled and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Telefonica became an empty husk floating upon a sea of sand, leaving just the ghost of Iqbal, awaiting his phone call. I do not know, Sahib. All I can recall is Iqbal also awaited a phone call, in the empty town of Telefonica. That he too awaited a release from this purgatory that was to be heralded by a ringing, to which he would say, I do not know, Sahib. All I can recall is Iqbal also awaited a phone call, in the empty town of Telephone Nagar, that he too awaited a release from this purgatory that was to be heralded by a ringing, to which he would say,